They told me I shouldn't come, but the truth is, they didn't have the courage to say it to my face. They just forgot to send the invitation, and I was supposed to take the hint, to quietly disappear like an old photograph left out in the rain. But when I arrived at the wedding uninvited, the groom's face told me everything I needed to know. The shock in his eyes, the stiffness of his jaw, the way he hesitated mid-step before forcing a smile that never reached his mouth. Those were my real invitations, the kind that said you are here, but you shouldn't be. I'm 81 years old. I live alone in a small apartment above a bakery that starts its ovens at 4 a.m. I wake to the smell of bread instead of family voices. That's fine. I've learned that silence, when it's honest, is better than the polite cruelty of people who speak only to make you small. Still, I ironed my blue dress the night before, the one I bought for my own 50th anniversary, and I took the early train to the countryside. I didn't bring a gift. I'd already given them enough: years, money, forgiveness. What more could they possibly unwrap from me? The train ride was long and bright with other people's happiness. Young women in pastel dresses, men in stiff collars, laughter spilling down the aisle like music I didn't know the words to anymore. I sat by the window and watched the fields blur into gold. My hands were folded neatly on my purse, the same one I carried to Kieran's baptism. He was so small then, trembling against my chest, his breath milk-sweet. I remember thinking, this one will never forget me. That thought used to comfort me, but somewhere between the christening and the engagement, it soured into disbelief. They say love fades with time, but that's not true. It's memory that fades, and people let it. Love stays where you left it, waiting like a suitcase on the curb. When I reached the town, I walked from the station to the church because I wanted the time to steady myself. The streets were narrow, old stone and ivy, too lovely for what I was about to do. I wasn't angry. Anger had burned out years ago, leaving only a kind of ash you can breathe without choking. I was determined, though. There's a difference. Determination doesn't tremble. It wears lipstick, keeps its back straight, and pretends the past was worth it. As I climbed the church steps, I caught sight of myself reflected in the glass doors. A woman with a soft face, hair too carefully pinned, eyes that had seen too much waiting. For a moment, I almost turned back. Then I remembered the message I'd left on Adam's voicemail when I found out about the wedding through a stranger's Facebook post. I hope you all have a wonderful day. That was it. My son hadn't called me since. I suppose I was hoping the wedding might make him remember who he came from. It didn't. Inside, the air smelled of lilies and polished wood. A violin was warming up somewhere near the altar. The guests turned as I entered, that collective rustle of fabric and surprise that follows a disruption in the script. I walked slowly down the aisle, my heels clicking like punctuation in a language only the old understand. No one stopped me. No one welcomed me either. I found a seat in the third row, on the groom's side, because that's where I belonged once upon a time. The pew was crowded with strangers, and yet I recognized the back of Adam's head 2 rows ahead. My son, my only child. He didn't turn around. Perhaps he felt me behind him, perhaps not. But when Kieran appeared at the front, tall and nervous in his suit, and our eyes met for the briefest moment, I knew the story had already ended. His face gave him away, confusion first, then shame, then something like grief. It's a terrible thing to realize your presence wounds the people you love most, simply by existing. The ceremony moved on without me. The bride's mother wept delicately into a lace handkerchief. The bridesmaids fluttered in pale blue like a row of sighs. I sat perfectly still, hands folded, back straight. I'd learned long ago that stillness can be a kind of defiance, Every vow they exchanged felt like a nail closing the lid on what used to be a family. When they were pronounced husband and wife, I didn't clap. I couldn't. My palms wouldn't obey. Instead, I looked at Kieran's new wife, radiant and oblivious, and tried to imagine what she'd been told about me. Probably that I was difficult, forgetful, sentimental to a fault. Old women are always one adjective away from being erased. I wondered if she knew I'd once taught Kieran how to tie his shoes, how I'd sat up through nights of his asthma attacks, counting his breaths until dawn. None of that mattered now. History doesn't make good table talk at weddings. When the music began and the guests rose, I stayed seated until the aisle cleared. My knees ached when I finally stood. A young usher approached, kind smile trembling on his lips. "Are you with the groom's family, ma'am?" he asked, and I answered, "Not anymore." He blinked, uncertain, then nodded as if he understood. I walked out into the sunlight, blinking against it, and the bells rang behind me like laughter. Outside, the reception tent gleamed white on the lawn. I could have gone home then. I should have. But something in me, something stubborn and quiet, needed to see it through. Closure isn't a word people my age trust. We know some doors never shut cleanly. I walked across the grass, careful not to sink my heels in, and found an empty chair at a table near the edge. The table card shimmered in the breeze, gold calligraphy, expensive paper. My name wasn't there, of course. Still, I sat. The waiter hesitated, but poured me water anyway. Bless him for that small rebellion. From where I sat, I could see Kieran and his bride posing for photographs. They looked beautiful, young in that untouchable way youth always is, like sunlight you can't hold. He laughed, but his laughter sounded rehearsed. Every so often his gaze swept the crowd, never landing on me. That was mercy, I think. When Adam finally saw me, mid-toast, glass raised, his words stumbled. He recovered quickly, the practiced smile of a man used to managing appearances. "To family," he said. The irony nearly made me choke. Around me, guests clinked glasses, laughter rippled, and I realized how invisible you can become even while sitting in the middle of your own bloodline. It wasn't cruelty, not really. It was convenience. They needed a version of me that didn't breathe, didn't interrupt their clean narrative of success. And yet, here I was, in full color, refusing to fade. I left before dessert, slipping out through the side of the tent where the caterers moved like quiet ghosts. One of them, a boy no older than 19, offered me a small plate of cake. "For the road," he said. I took it, not out of hunger, but gratitude. He didn't know who I was or wasn't. He just saw an old woman alone and thought she might want sweetness. Outside, the air had cooled. The last of the sunset lay over the fields like a tired promise. I walked to the road where the taxis waited, cake balanced on my palm like a fragile truth. When I looked back, I could still hear the music, faint and muffled, the sound of celebration in a house that no longer had my name in it. I told myself I wasn't crying. It was just the wind. But the truth is, when Kieran looked at me at the altar, his face didn't just tell me I didn't belong. It told me he remembered why I once did. And that small, painful recognition was enough to keep me standing, to remind me I had not vanished. I had simply arrived too soon for their forgiveness, and just in time for my own. The wedding had ended, but the true moment of betrayal had begun weeks before, long before the music, the flowers, and the uncomfortable smiles. It began the evening I found out there was a wedding at all. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the one with a scratch across the surface where Derek once dropped a toolbox, when my neighbor Clara came by to return a casserole dish. She had that careful tone people use when they know something you don't, but aren't sure if it will hurt to say it. I saw the loveliest picture online, she said, unwrapping her scarf. Your grandson's getting married, isn't he? The world seemed to tilt slightly, just a small tremor, but enough to make the air feel heavy. Married? I asked, my voice a little too even. Oh, yes, it's all over social media. They look radiant. She pulled out her phone and showed me the post, a picture of Kieran and a girl with sunlight in her hair, holding hands in front of a vineyard. The caption read, "Counting down to forever, a Harlow wedding." My name wasn't tagged, of course. I stared at the image for a long time, trying to decide what hurt more, the beauty of it or my absence in its frame. That night I called Adam. I told myself I would sound casual, not accusing, not emotional, just curious, like any mother might be. He didn't answer the first time, or the second. On the third attempt, he picked up. "Mom," he said, like the word itself was an inconvenience. "Everything okay?" I asked. A long pause followed, the kind of silence that tells you the truth before the words arrive. "We were going to tell you," he began, his voice smooth, professional. "It's just been hectic. The kids, the work, the arrangements." "So it's true then?" I said. "Kieran's getting married?" Another pause, another breath I could almost hear through the receiver. "It's complicated," he said finally. "Complicated how? Either there's a wedding or there isn't." "There is," he admitted. "Next month." I waited for the invitation that would surely follow, for the reassurance that this was just a misunderstanding. It didn't come. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" I asked. "We didn't want to overwhelm you," he said softly. "It's going to be a big event, a lot of travel. We weren't sure it would be comfortable for you." Comfortable. That word lodged in my chest like a stone. I could feel my pulse in my wrists, slow but deliberate. "Adam," I said carefully, "I've traveled across oceans. I've buried a husband and half my friends. I think I can handle a wedding." He sighed, the way men sigh when they've already made up their minds. "Mom, it's not about that. It's just that things are different now. Kieran and Leah, well, they want to keep it small, intimate, just immediate family." "I am immediate family," I said, my voice shaking only slightly. "You are," he replied quickly, too quickly. "Of course you are. It's just, Leah's parents are hosting, and their guest list, it's complicated." There it was again, that word. Complicated, as if love were a tax form, as if affection required management and strategy. "So I'm not invited," I said finally, letting the truth fall between us like a plate shattering. "It's not like that," he said. "Then what is it like, Adam?" But he didn't answer. The line buzzed quietly, the sound of distance filling every space between us. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Harder for whom?" I asked, but he had already decided the call was over. "We'll talk soon," he said, his voice tightening, and then the line went dead. I sat there with the phone in my lap, staring at the dark window. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, small beacons of a world that kept moving, indifferent to who got left behind. On the table lay a half-finished crossword and a cup of tea gone cold. I picked up the pencil and tried to fill in the next word, but the clues blurred together. I thought of Kieran at 10 years old, running down the driveway in his soccer cleats, shouting for me to watch him score. I had been at every game, every school concert, every milestone. I had loved him in the quiet, invisible ways that no one photographs. And now I was being erased not by death, but by discretion. Over the next few days, I waited for an apology that didn't come. I checked the mail each morning, half expecting an invitation addressed in Adam's neat handwriting. Nothing. No letter, no call, not even a text. The house began to feel smaller, as if the walls were closing in around my disappointment. I tried to distract myself with routine, watering the plants, folding laundry, visiting the market. But everything seemed to echo the same question. What did I do wrong? Clara stopped by again, eager to gossip about the venue, the dress, the color scheme. I smiled politely, nodding at the right moments, pretending I was part of the story. When she left, I closed the door gently and leaned against it, breathing slowly. That's when I realized it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. A week later, I sent a small package to Adam's address. A silver photo frame, engraved with Kieran's initials, wrapped in cream paper. Inside, I included a note, short, simple, polite. For the happy couple, wishing them love and peace. I imagined them opening it, perhaps at the rehearsal dinner, smiling awkwardly, whispering explanations to those who might ask who it was from. Maybe they'd set it aside unopened. Maybe they'd return it. In the end, it didn't matter. The act of sending it was my final gesture of belonging, a message they could ignore but not erase. Days passed without response. The silence became a presence of its own, a constant hum in the background of my days. I stopped expecting the phone to ring. I stopped cooking proper meals. I ate toast for dinner, washed it down with tea that tasted of nothing. On the third Sunday, I went to church, hoping prayer might dull the ache. But even there, sitting in the pew where I'd knelt for decades, I couldn't focus. The hymns felt empty, the words of comfort hollow. When the service ended, the pastor shook my hand and said, "It's lovely to see you, Martha. We've missed you." I wanted to ask him if he'd ever been deliberately forgotten by his own blood, but instead I smiled and said I'd see him next week. That night, I took out the family photo albums. The pages smelled faintly of dust and lemon oil. There were Adam's baby pictures, Derek's proud grin, Kieran's first steps captured in soft sunlight. Every page was a record of a love that had once been real and visible. I ran my hand over one photograph, Kieran on my lap, both of us laughing at something just outside the frame. I wondered if he remembered that moment, or if memory had been edited the same way photographs are now, cropped for convenience. I closed the album and whispered to the empty room, "You can't delete a person." The words didn't echo, but they settled somewhere deep, solid as a vow. In the morning, I made a decision. If they wouldn't invite me, I would invite myself, not out of pride, but necessity. I needed to see it with my own eyes, to know whether the love I'd given had truly vanished or simply been buried under layers of embarrassment and pretense. I found the date of the wedding easily. Public posts make secrets hard to keep. I checked the train schedules, noted the route, and circled the day on my calendar. It wasn't a plan for confrontation. It was a plan for truth. I didn't tell anyone, not Clara, not the ladies at the market, not even the pastor. I wanted no witnesses to my humiliation, no sympathy if I was turned away at the door. I would go quietly, like someone visiting a grave. Only this grave was for the living, and I was going to see who had buried me. The week before the wedding, I pressed my blue dress, polished my shoes, and packed a small bag. I placed the unused photo frame back on my dresser, its silver edges gleaming in the afternoon light. "For the happy couple," I said softly. Then, with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years, I turned off the lights and went to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the sigh of the wind outside my window. My mind replayed Adam's voice on the phone, that measured tone of someone managing a situation. It's complicated. That phrase became a refrain in my head, twisting into something colder, crueler. It wasn't complicated at all. It was simple. They were ashamed. Ashamed of my age, my modest apartment, my presence that reminded them of a life less polished than the one they'd built. And yet, despite everything, I loved them still. That's the curse of mothers. We forgive even when we shouldn't. We hope even when hope makes fools of us. The night before the wedding, I wrote a short note and tucked it into my purse. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It simply read, "I am coming because I existed." I didn't know if I would hand it to anyone or leave it behind, but it felt right to have it with me, a declaration no one could take away. When dawn came, I rose, dressed, and looked in the mirror. My reflection was calm, composed, almost serene. The years had softened me, but they hadn't erased me. As I locked the door behind me and stepped into the cool morning air, I felt something shift inside, a quiet resolve, a reclamation of my own name. Whatever awaited me at that wedding, I would face it not as an unwanted guest, but as the woman who had given them all their beginning. And that, no matter what they believed, was an invitation written in blood and memory, impossible to revoke. The morning of the wedding broke gray and cool, with a thin mist curling over the rooftops, like hesitation made visible. I woke before the alarm, though I had set it carefully, more for the comfort of control than necessity. My suitcase was already packed from the night before, the blue dress folded between sheets of tissue, my old pearls in a velvet pouch, a pair of low heels I hadn't worn since Derek's funeral. I made coffee but didn't drink it. It smelled burnt, like nerves. I sat at the kitchen table, the one that had seen every celebration and disappointment of my family, and looked at the small note I'd written days earlier. I am coming because I existed. It was still there, folded neatly inside my purse. I considered throwing it away, telling myself it was dramatic, foolish even, but something in me knew that paper was the only voice I could trust to stay steady. People quiver, paper doesn't. When I stepped out, the air had that particular chill of late autumn that bites gently before surrendering to light. The bakery downstairs was just opening. The smell of yeast and sugar floated up through the vents. The baker's wife saw me locking my door and called out a greeting, something cheerful, something that didn't belong to the day I was walking into. I smiled and waved, grateful she didn't ask where I was going. The less spoken, the lighter the truth becomes. At the train station, I bought a ticket to a town whose name I could hardly pronounce. The woman at the counter smiled mechanically, tapping at her screen with the bored rhythm of habit. "Round trip?" she asked. "One way," I replied. I didn't know if I meant it as poetry or prophecy. The platform was almost empty, a group of teenagers huddled by the vending machine, laughing too loudly. A man in a gray coat paced while talking into a headset. I stood apart, hands clasped on the handle of my purse, a small blue figure in a world that had forgotten the weight of waiting. The train arrived with a sigh and I boarded, choosing a window seat near the back. As the city receded, I watched the landscape flatten into wide stretches of golden brown. The trees along the tracks were losing their leaves, and I found comfort in their surrender. Letting go can be graceful when you stop expecting spring to return. Across the aisle, a young woman was reading a bridal magazine, a ring glittering on her finger. I wanted to tell her that marriage isn't built on photographs and table settings, that love has a way of fraying even under the prettiest lace, but I kept quiet. Advice from strangers rarely saves them. The rhythm of the train was hypnotic. I drifted somewhere between memory and resolve. I remembered the first wedding I ever attended as a child. My cousins in a church that smelled of lilies and candle smoke. My mother had whispered in my ear that weddings were just rehearsals for patience. "It's not the day that matters," she said. "It's who stays when the day is over." I didn't understand it then. I do now. I've spent a lifetime watching people walk away from what they once swore was permanent. Adam's father had walked in his own quiet way, physically still there, but emotionally retired long before his heart gave out. Adam learned from him, though not what I hoped he would. Distance can be inherited like eye color. 2 hours later, the train slid into the small station of Greenvale. The town was postcard pretty. Cobblestone streets, tidy gardens, and banners fluttering from lampposts announcing the upcoming harvest fair. I stepped onto the platform, gripping my coat tighter around me. My knees protested the climb up the stairs, but I moved with purpose. I hailed a cab, gave the driver the address I'd copied from an online post about the venue, and watched as the town rolled past, a world polished for celebration, as if nothing ugly had ever happened there. The driver tried to make conversation, the kind that fills silence with harmless words. I nodded when appropriate, smiled when required. When he asked if I was attending the wedding, I said yes, and he grinned. "Big day for someone, huh?" "It always is," I replied. The car turned down a long gravel drive, lined with maples that arched overhead like a cathedral of gold. The estate appeared at the end, all glass and stone, modern and proud. I'd expected something warmer, something that looked like it had a history, but of course not. This was Adam's taste now, clean and impressive, the kind of place you book to show the world you've arrived. He always wanted proof. I paid the driver and stepped out, my shoes crunching against the gravel. A few guests milled about the entrance, laughing softly, the women's heels sinking into the earth. No one noticed me. I walked past them, keeping my chin high, each step a quiet defiance against invisibility. Inside, the foyer gleamed like a mirror, white flowers everywhere, more than necessary, like they were trying to disguise the lack of sincerity with abundance. I spotted a sign-in book at the entrance embossed with "Welcome to the Wedding of Kieran and Leah." Beneath it, rows of names in looping cursive, none of which were mine. I picked up the pen, hesitated, then wrote simply, "Martha." No surname. No role. Just the truth of my first name, unadorned. The woman at the reception desk, young, nervous, perhaps a distant cousin, looked at me uncertainly. "Can I help you find your seat?" she asked. "No, thank you," I said. "I know where I belong." She smiled, relieved not to have to decide whether I did or didn't. The ceremony was in a greenhouse-turned-chapel, glass walls dripping with condensation. The light filtered through like it was afraid to intrude. Guests whispered, adjusted programs, checked their phones. I sat in the back, a safe distance between me and judgment. Every so often I caught sight of Adam moving through the crowd, his posture rehearsed, his smile courteous but thin. I wondered if he felt me there, the way you feel a storm coming even before the rain. When the music began and Kieran appeared at the front, I thought my heart might stop from the sheer weight of recognition. He looked older, sharper, but still carried that softness in his eyes, the one I'd once believed would protect him from cruelty. For a brief second, his gaze drifted toward the back, and our eyes met. It was accidental, inevitable. He froze, just slightly, and then looked away. That half-second was enough to split my world clean in two. The ceremony unfolded like a play I had already read. The officiant spoke of love, commitment, family, words that once meant something but now felt ornamental. When they said their vows, I found myself mouthing them too, out of old habit, though I had no one left to promise anything to. I thought of Adam and how vows hadn't made him kind, how family hadn't made him loyal. It's strange how we teach our children to value truth and then punish them when they use it against our illusions. When the officiant declared them married, everyone rose to applaud. I remained seated. It wasn't protest, it was fatigue. Applause felt like endorsement, and I could no longer endorse the performance. After the ceremony, people poured into the reception hall like water finding its level. I followed at my own pace, neither hiding nor announcing myself. The room was a glittering blur of glassware, music, and too bright laughter. The scent of roses mixed with something metallic, maybe from the chandeliers. I found a corner table near the window, set down my purse, and exhaled. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened glass, ghostly but calm. For a while, I simply observed the clinking of champagne flutes, the rehearsed toasts, the way Adam placed his hand on Leah's mother's arm when he laughed. He'd become a man of gestures, each one designed for an audience. A waiter approached, offering hors d'oeuvres. He was young, polite, the kind of boy who still said ma'am with respect rather than pity. I took a small plate and thanked him. He smiled, and for a fleeting moment I felt seen, not as someone out of place, but simply as a person. Then, from across the room, I heard my name, or maybe thought I did. I turned. Adam stood near the head table, his eyes fixed on me. It was the same look he used to give when he was caught in a lie as a child, alarmed, ashamed, calculating. He excused himself from his circle and crossed the room, his steps too measured. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing here?" "I came to see my grandson get married," I said evenly. "Isn't that what families do?" He glanced around nervously. "You should have called first." "Would you have answered?" He didn't reply. His jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. "This isn't the time," he said finally. "Then when is?" I asked. His silence was my answer. He left me standing there, the hum of music swallowing our conversation. I returned to my seat, my food untouched. I thought I'd feel humiliated, but what I felt instead was oddly clear, almost peaceful. There's freedom in knowing the worst has already happened. The world doesn't collapse when people show you who they are. It just rearranges itself around the truth. As the evening stretched on, I slipped outside for air. The garden was lit with lanterns, the grass still damp from an earlier drizzle. I walked along the path lined with white roses, each one too perfect to be real. Somewhere inside, laughter erupted, one of those forced bursts meant to prove happiness. I looked up at the sky, a low wash of gray, and thought of my mother's words again. "It's who stays when the day is over." I whispered them aloud, my breath a small cloud in the cold. No one had stayed for me, but I had stayed for myself, and for now, that was enough to keep walking. When I returned to the hall, the lights had dimmed, and the dance floor was full. I lingered by the doorway, watching as Kieran and Leah moved together under the soft haze of music. His hand rested on her back, his expression somewhere between joy and fear. Maybe he felt my eyes on him, maybe not. But I saw what I needed to see. Love wasn't absent from him. It was just redirected. And love redirected can still wound the one it leaves behind. I stayed until the song ended, until the applause rose again. And then I turned toward the exit. No one tried to stop me. The world outside was colder now, sharper, honest. I walked down the long drive toward the road, my heels leaving faint impressions in the gravel, and thought how strange it was that leaving could feel more like arriving. When I reached the station again that night, the platform was nearly empty, just a few tired souls waiting for trains that seemed as uncertain as they were. The lights hummed above, flickering like thoughts I couldn't quite silence. My shoes were damp from the grass, and the hem of my blue dress had collected the scent of wet soil and roses. I should have felt foolish, I suppose. An old woman who had shown up uninvited to a celebration that had no space for her. But instead, I felt oddly steady, as though some quiet truth had finally taken root inside me. The worst had already happened. They had forgotten me in full daylight, and yet the world hadn't stopped turning. That realization, small and devastating, was also liberating. It meant I could move again without asking anyone's permission. I bought a ticket for the late train, though I barely knew where it would take me. The clerk asked for my destination, and I said, "Anywhere that's still open." He gave me a strange look, but printed the ticket anyway. The train to Portland left in 20 minutes. I remembered it dimly from years ago, when Derek and I used to take short trips just to feel young again, when weekends meant discovery instead of recovery. Maybe it was foolish, but the thought of retracing a road that had once held pieces of my happiness felt like something close to courage. I sat on the cold metal bench, clutching the paper ticket as if it were a key, and watched the mist drift across the tracks. When the train arrived, I chose a seat by the window again. There's something about movement at night that makes everything seem temporary, even the hurt. The rhythm of wheels against rails has a way of loosening what pride refuses to release. I rested my head against the glass and let the scenery smear into abstraction. Towns with single streetlights, gas stations still open, a handful of late diners glowing in the dark. Every passing mile felt like an erasure, a soft undoing of the day behind me. Somewhere after midnight, the train crossed a river, and I saw my reflection floating on the surface of the glass, a face lined with time but not yet broken. I whispered to it, "You are still here," and for the first time in years, I believed it. When dawn began to soften the edges of the world, the train slowed. The conductor announced the next stop, Portland. I hadn't been there in half a century. The name alone carried the scent of rain and the taste of early choices. Derek and I had lived there right after we married, in a one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store, where the floors creaked and the radiator hissed like a living thing. We were poor then, but unashamed, two people with more hope than sense. I hadn't thought about that place in years, but as I stepped off the train, a memory bloomed so vividly it felt like déjà vu. Maybe that's why I didn't feel lost when I walked into the damp morning air with no plan at all, just a vague direction my feet seemed to remember on their own. The city was quieter than I remembered. The air smelled of coffee and wet asphalt. I found a small cafe near the station and ordered breakfast, though I wasn't hungry. The waitress called me dear and refilled my cup twice without asking questions. That small kindness cracked something open in me. I realized how long it had been since anyone had spoken to me without agenda, without calculation. When she left the bill on the table, I tucked a few extra dollars beneath the saucer, not as charity, but as gratitude for gentleness. After breakfast, I walked aimlessly through the streets until my knees protested. I passed bookshops and flower stalls, bakeries and laundromats, each one reminding me that life goes on everywhere, regardless of who remembers you. I turned a corner and stopped in front of a small house with peeling blue paint. There was something about it, the slant of the porch, the wind chime swaying by the door, that stirred recognition. I crossed the street slowly, unsure whether memory was playing tricks. On the mailbox, Faint but still legible beneath layers of rust were the numbers 1849. My old address. The house where Derek and I had spent the first 2 years of our marriage. The sight of it nearly unstrung me. I stood there for a long time, the world narrowing until only that doorway existed. It looked smaller now, humbler, surrounded by taller buildings that made it seem shy. The curtains were different, floral instead of plain, but the window boxes were still there. I could almost see my younger self leaning out, calling Derek in for dinner, her voice sure and bright, unafraid of echo. The woman who lived there now stepped out onto the porch to water a plant. She glanced at me, then smiled, not the wary smile of strangers, but the instinctive one people give when they sense they're being looked at kindly. I nodded back. I wanted to tell her I used to live there, that the air around that house had once been thick with my laughter, my arguments, my beginnings, but I didn't. Some memories are better left unspoken. They live more truthfully in silence. I turned and kept walking. By noon, I had found a small motel a few blocks away. The sign outside promised clean rooms and honest prices. I had just enough cash in my wallet to afford one night. The woman behind the desk looked like she had been there forever, the kind of person who had seen every version of Lost. "You traveling alone?" she asked. I nodded. "Just passing through," I said. "Aren't we all?" she replied, sliding the key across the counter. The room was small but tidy, one bed, one chair, one window facing the street. I dropped my purse on the dresser and sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time in years, I felt like no one could reach me. Not through guilt, not through expectation, not even through love. It was both terrifying and peaceful. I lay back and stared at the ceiling until the cracks formed constellations. The exhaustion of months, maybe years, caught up with me all at once. I closed my eyes and let sleep take me without resistance. When I woke, the light outside had turned to gold. I went to the window and watched people moving through their lives. Someone walking a dog, a child riding a bicycle too fast, a couple arguing softly. I envied their ordinariness. There is a strange comfort in belonging to the rhythm of everyday life, a rhythm I had somehow fallen out of without noticing. I made a promise to myself then, silent but absolute. I would no longer live like a ghost, haunting the edges of other people's celebrations. If my family had no room for me, I would build a small life of my own, simple and sufficient. It wouldn't be glamorous, but it would be mine. The next morning, I asked the motel clerk if she knew of any places renting rooms by the week. She pointed me toward a bulletin board in the lobby covered in faded notices. Between offers for used bicycles and guitar lessons, I saw one written in large block letters. Room for rent, quiet house, no drama, cash only. It had a phone number and the name Joyce. The handwriting was steady, practical, the kind that suggested no nonsense. I copied the number into my notebook and walked to the payphone outside. The line rang 4 times before a voice answered, gravelly and suspicious. "Yes? I'm calling about the room," I said. "You clean?" she asked immediately. "Yes," I replied. "How old are you?" 79, I said. "Good," she said. "Less trouble that way. Can you come by at 4? "I can," I said. "Bring cash for the first week," she added, and hung up without goodbye. At 4 o'clock sharp, I stood in front of a faded blue house with sagging gutters and a porch that creaked under my weight. Joyce opened the door, a small woman in her late 60s with a cigarette between her fingers and a cat at her feet. "You're the one who called?" she asked. I nodded. "Come in then. Let's see if you pass the sniff test." The house smelled like onions and lavender, an oddly comforting mix. She led me through a hallway cluttered with books and old newspapers. The room she showed me was upstairs, small but filled with sunlight. "Rent's weekly," she said. "Cash only. No guests, no nonsense, no noise after 10. "Fair," I said. "You cook?" "When I'm hungry." She smirked. "You'll do." She held out her hand, and I shook it. Her grip was strong, anchoring. "Welcome home," she said, half mocking, but not unkind. That evening, after unpacking my few belongings, I sat by the window in my new room. Outside, the street lamp flickered, casting light that pulsed gently against the curtains. I made tea in the small kettle Joyce had left on the nightstand and sipped it slowly, feeling warmth spread through me like forgiveness. It struck me then that the day I'd been excluded from my family's happiness had become the day I reclaimed my own autonomy, not as a rebellion, but as a quiet act of self-respect. I didn't know what would come next, work, friendship, perhaps even laughter, but for the first time in a long time, I wanted to find out. The night was still, and somewhere downstairs, Joyce was talking softly to her cat, the sound low and steady, like a heartbeat reminding me that life, however small, was still mine to keep. The first days at Joyce's house unfolded with the rhythm of a life I didn't know I still remembered how to live. She was a woman who spoke little but noticed everything, her silences neither cold nor expectant, but simply practical, as though conversation were a resource to be used sparingly. The house itself seemed to exhale around her, its old pipes groaning like an animal settling into its own warmth. In the mornings, she fried eggs and brewed coffee that tasted faintly of burnt toast, and in the evenings, she watched television with the volume low, her cat Franklin purring on the arm of her chair. I fell into that routine as easily as slipping into an old coat. It was a rhythm that asked for nothing and gave back the smallest kindnesses, shared meals, a roof that didn't echo with someone else's disappointment, a place where my presence didn't need justification. That was new to me. For decades, I had been the woman who made herself smaller to fit the shape of other people's comfort. Now I was learning awkwardly what it felt like to take up space again. I began walking in the mornings, first around the block, then farther, 3, sometimes 4 miles if the weather allowed. Portland has a way of forgiving the slow walker. The air smells of moss and rain, and the city seems to welcome solitude. I found a small cafe tucked into a corner between a laundromat and a florist, its sign hand-painted and slightly tilted. One morning, taped to the inside of the glass door, was a handwritten note. "Help wanted, morning shift, reliable only." I hesitated outside, reading it twice. I hadn't worked in years, not since my joints began to ache, and Adam insisted I'd take it easy. The idea of applying for a job at 79 felt almost absurd, yet the thought quickened something in me, a flicker of usefulness. I went inside. The woman behind the counter looked younger than my shoes, but had kind eyes. She glanced at me, surprised when I asked about the job. "You want to apply?" she said. I nodded. "You have experience?" "Half a century of it," I said. "I've raised a family, run a household, and made more coffee than your machine could handle." She smiled slightly, uncertain whether I was joking. "We open at 6, she said. "Trial shift tomorrow. If you make it through the rush, you're in." That night I ironed my best blouse and lay awake longer than I expected, the anticipation a quiet hum beneath my ribs. It had been years since I'd needed to prove myself to anyone. The next morning, I arrived early, apron tied, hair pinned back. The place smelled of yeast, cinnamon, and the faint metallic tang of an overworked espresso machine. The first customers trickled in before dawn, truck drivers and nurses just off shift. My hands remembered the motions, pouring coffee, wiping counters, smiling at strangers without surrendering to them. The manager, a stocky woman named Heather with a sharp tongue and tired eyes, watched me like she was waiting for me to falter. I didn't. By 9, the rush had thinned, and she handed me a clean towel. "You're slow," she said, "but you don't make mistakes." I smiled. "I've had practice." She nodded once, the closest she came to approval. "You're hired," she said, and walked away. The first paycheck was small, $74.26. But when I held that envelope, something inside me straightened. It wasn't about the money. It was about proof, the kind that doesn't need permission. That weekend, I walked downtown and found a secondhand clothing shop. On the rack near the back hung a navy wool coat, long, tailored, and softer than anything I'd worn in years. I tried it on, and the fit was perfect, almost uncanny. When I paid in cash, the young woman behind the counter wrapped it carefully, as though it were something precious. "It looks like it was made for you," she said. "It was," I replied, and realized only later that I meant it. That coat became my armor, a quiet declaration that I was no longer someone's afterthought. Time in Joyce's house moved in gentle circles. She took me as I was, neither intrusive nor indifferent. On Sundays, we watched old movies and pretended to critique the acting. She had an acerbic humor that delighted me, calling the cat his royal entitlement whenever he refused to eat the cheaper food. Sometimes she'd glance at me across the kitchen table and say, "You're healing, you know." I'd shrug, unwilling to admit it aloud, but she was right. Healing doesn't arrive with fanfare. It creeps in through ordinary days until one morning you wake and realize you've stopped bracing for hurt. I stopped expecting apologies. I stopped checking the mailbox for letters that would never come. It was enough to have mornings filled with the smell of coffee and evenings that ended in laughter instead of silence. But peace has a way of summoning its opposite, as if the universe distrusts contentment in women like me. One Thursday, a letter arrived. The envelope was plain, no return address, but the handwriting struck me like a familiar scent. I knew those loops, that careful slant. My grandson, Kieran. My hands trembled as I opened it. The note inside was brief, written on lined paper torn from a notebook. "Grandma," it began. "Where are you? Dad and Mom are worried. They said you disappeared. I've been trying to find you. Please let me know you're okay. I miss you." The simplicity of it undid me. I read it 3 times before folding it back into the envelope. For days I carried it in my pocket, touching it like a talisman whenever the weight of the past threatened to return. I didn't reply. Not yet. I didn't know how to speak to love that hadn't stood up for me when it mattered. But the letter softened me, loosening the bitterness I hadn't realized was calcifying in my chest. I started smiling at strangers again. I even laughed one afternoon when Joyce locked herself out of the house and swore at the sky. Life, fragile and ordinary, was happening again, and I was no longer watching it from the edges. Then came the morning when Heather handed me a folded newspaper. "You're famous," she said dryly. My stomach dropped before I even saw the headline. On the front page of the local section was my photograph, a smiling image from years ago, lifted from some family post. The title read, "Missing Matriarch, Family Pleads for Grandmother's Return." Below it, Adam's words in neat black print. "We're deeply concerned," he was quoted. "She vanished without a word. We just want to know she's safe." Lisa's quote followed. "She's vulnerable, easily confused. We're praying for her." I sat very still, reading the lies as though they were someone else's story. Vulnerable, confused. My pulse thudded, not with fear, but fury. How easily they twisted the truth, turning their abandonment into my disappearance, their guilt into pity. Heather's voice broke through the static in my head. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "Never better," I said, folding the paper, but my hands betrayed me, trembling against the edge of the counter. That evening, I showed the article to Joyce. She read it slowly, her cigarette burning down to ash. "They really said vulnerable?" she asked. I nodded. "Then sue them for underestimating you." I laughed, a sound sharper than humor. "I don't need to. They already know what I am now. They just can't stand that it isn't theirs to define." She grinned. "Good answer." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the article's words looping in my mind. They weren't searching for me. They were searching for control. To the world, it would look like concern, but I knew the truth. Some people only remember your value when you stop being available for use. A week later, while I was clearing tables after the breakfast rush, Heather whispered, "Someone's here for you." I turned, half expecting a stranger, half dreading a ghost. It was Lisa. She stood just inside the doorway, perfectly dressed as always, her eyes darting nervously toward the floor. I felt the entire cafe pause, sensing the tension before understanding it. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked over. "Lisa," I said, the name tasting foreign. "Martha," she replied softly. "Can we talk?" I gestured to an empty booth. She sat, hands folded too neatly, the posture of someone rehearsing an apology she doesn't believe in. "We were worried," she began, but I cut her off. "No, you were embarrassed." Her eyes flickered. "That's not fair." "Neither was leaving me at an airport," I said. Her voice dropped lower. "It wasn't like that." "Then how was it?" I asked. "Because I've spent months wondering, what kind of love mistakes an old woman for luggage?" She looked down, the facade cracking for the first time. "We thought you were behind us," she murmured. "You weren't." I said it flatly, not as accusation, but as fact. "We made a terrible mistake," she whispered. "You did," I agreed. "And now you're here to undo it with excuses." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "Kieran wrote you again. He's worried sick. Adam's furious, but Kieran, he just wants to see you." I took the envelope, more out of habit than hope. "He knows how to reach me," I said. "He doesn't need a messenger." She nodded slowly, her face pale. "I wasn't trying to replace you," she said after a long silence. "I just didn't want your shadow in every room." That honesty, thin, brittle, and late, landed harder than all her previous lies. "I'm not your shadow," I said quietly. "I'm the woman who built the roof you're living under." She flinched, and for a moment I almost pitied her. But pity is a luxury you stop affording people who've mistaken your kindness for weakness. She left soon after, her perfume lingering like an afterthought. When the door closed behind her, Heather approached, eyes wary. "You sure you're okay?" she asked again. I looked around the cafe, the clean counters, the smell of coffee and fresh pastry, the quiet hum of a life that was finally mine. "Yes," I said. "I'm fine." But fine wasn't the right word. I was becoming something else, clear, unafraid, defined only by myself. That night, back at Joyce's, I opened the envelope Lisa had left. Inside was a photograph of me holding Kieran when he was a boy, both of us laughing. Behind it, a small note in his handwriting. "I remember, I always remembered." It was enough to make the air leave my lungs. I didn't cry. I simply sat with it, the weight of that small mercy anchoring me. The next morning, I walked to the bank, my coat buttoned, the photograph in my pocket. I opened an account in Kieran's name and transferred a modest sum, the remains of the savings Adam didn't know about. The teller asked if I wanted to include a note. I thought for a moment, then said, "Just this, no strings attached." When she smiled, I realized how rare those words felt. Everything in my life until now had come with conditions. Be quieter, be useful, be less visible. This was the opposite. It was a gift with no demand. Freedom, I decided, isn't just leaving. It's giving without the hunger to be thanked. That evening, I sat with Joyce on the porch. The air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke. She poured wine into mismatched mugs and said, "You look lighter." I nodded. "I wrote my last letter today." "To them?" "To myself, really," I said. She raised her mug. "To that, then." We drank in silence, the kind that needs no translation. Inside, Franklin meowed impatiently, demanding dinner. The world, indifferent and generous, kept turning. I thought of the article, the visits, the lies, and all the years I'd spent waiting to be seen. And for the first time, I understood that invisibility isn't a punishment when you choose it yourself. It can be shelter, a place to grow back your own voice. I went to bed that night, knowing the storm had passed, not because it had ended, but because I had stopped standing in its path. The letter I wrote that day had no return address and no apology inside it. I began it 3 times, on 3 separate sheets of paper, each start collapsing under the weight of everything unsaid. Finally, I stopped trying to make it eloquent and let the words come out plain, bare, unpolished. "Kieran," I wrote, "you don't owe me a visit, a photo, or a seat at your table. You owe yourself the truth of where you come from. You were loved without condition once, long before anyone taught you that love is earned. I am not missing. I am not fragile. I am not waiting. But I am watching the world turn again with peace, and I want that peace for you." When I sealed the envelope, my hands didn't tremble. There was a clarity to the motion, an ease that comes when you finally stop performing the role other people have written for you. I mailed it at the post office the next morning, the clerk asking if I wanted a tracking number. "No," I said, "it will find him or it won't." That was the whole truth. Afterward, I went to work at the cafe as usual, tying my apron, taking orders, smiling when appropriate. The smell of coffee and sugar had become my rhythm, the scent of ordinary salvation. I didn't expect anything to change, but the world, in its perverse way, always waits until you've steadied yourself before shifting the ground again. It was late afternoon when I heard the bell above the door. The light from outside framed him before I recognized the shape of him. Kieran, older, broader, eyes both familiar and foreign. He hesitated, scanning the room until his gaze landed on me. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then he walked forward, slowly, like someone approaching an altar. I wiped my hands on the towel, my heart an unruly drum. "Grandma," he said, his voice softer than memory. "You found me," I replied. "It wasn't hard," he said, smiling a little. "I've been looking. Most people stop when the search gets uncomfortable." He lowered his eyes. "I deserve that." "You don't deserve anything," I said, "good or bad. You just have to start from the truth." He exhaled, that long, broken sigh of someone who has carried too much. "I didn't know," he said. "About the wedding, about what Dad said, about how they kept you out of everything. I thought you were sick. They told me you were forgetful, that you wouldn't remember much. I let the words pass between us without interruption. "And you believed them," I said finally. I wanted to believe them. It was easier than thinking we'd been cruel. I nodded. "Easier never means better. You'll learn that someday." Heather pretended to busy herself behind the counter, but her eyes flickered toward us every few seconds, like a bird checking the wind. Kieran sat down at the corner table, and I joined him. He looked out of place there, in his pressed shirt and expensive shoes, but I could still see the boy who used to collect seashells with me on the coast, who cried when we had to leave them behind. "Why did you disappear?" he asked. "I didn't disappear," I said. "I stopped standing where I wasn't wanted." "Dad said you ran away." "Your father's always been fond of narratives that absolve him," I said, and his mouth twitched in a reluctant smile. "He told the papers you were confused," he murmured. "I read it," I said. "I also read between the lines." He laughed softly, then covered his face with his hands. "I'm sorry, Grandma." I reached across the table and touched his wrist. "No," I said. "You're young. You're learning. Save your apologies for what you do next, not what was done before." We sat in silence for a long moment, the kind that feels like a truce. When he finally spoke, his voice was steadier. "I want you to come home," he said. "I am home," I replied. "Not here," he said quickly. "With us." "With you," I corrected gently. "Not with him." And even then, no. I built my own peace here. I don't intend to abandon it just because guilt built a spare room. His shoulders slumped, and for a moment he looked like that frightened little boy again. "I just thought you might want to see everyone." "They're different now. Everyone says that when the witness to their cruelty starts thriving without them," I said, and he flinched. "Maybe that's true," he whispered, "but I'm not them." "No," I said softly, "and that's why I opened your letter." He reached into his jacket and took out a photograph, the same one Lisa had given me, the one of us laughing. "I kept it," he said. "I carried it in my wallet for years, even when they told me not to." "Who tells someone not to remember love?" I asked quietly, but I didn't wait for an answer. I could see his throat tightening. "You don't have to fix this," I said. "Some things aren't meant to be repaired. They're meant to be understood and left behind." He looked at me then, his eyes wet, and for the first time I saw the man he might yet become, one who could hold both shame and tenderness without breaking under either. "I needed to see you," he said. "You just did," I replied. "Now go live something worth remembering." He hesitated before standing, then reached across the table again and squeezed my hand. His palm was warm, unsteady, real. "You're still wearing blue," he said, half smiling. "Always," I replied. "It hides the bruises." When he left, I didn't watch him go. I turned back to the counter, wiped it clean, and resumed pouring coffee. Heather came over a few minutes later, setting a cup of tea in front of me. "That your grandson?" she asked. "Was," I said. She nodded, not asking more. "He looked like he'd seen a ghost." "Maybe he did," I murmured. "But I'm done haunting anyone." That evening, after my shift, I walked home under a sky the color of pewter. The wind carried the smell of rain and wood smoke, a scent that always makes me think of endings. Joyce was sitting on the porch with Franklin in her lap, reading the paper. "Company today?" she asked, glancing up. "Family," I said. "The kind that arrives too late but still knocks." She folded the paper and motioned for me to sit beside her. "How'd it go?" "As well as anything that should have happened 20 years ago," I said. "But I did what I came here to do." "And what's that?" she asked. "I stopped waiting," I said. She smiled, a slow, proud curve. "Took you long enough." "79 years," I said, "but who's counting?" That night, I didn't sleep right away. I sat at my desk by the window, looking out at the streetlights flickering in the fog. There's a quiet moment that comes after you've reclaimed yourself, when the noise of regret fades and what's left is an almost holy stillness. I thought about Derek, about Adam, about every meal I'd cooked for people who had already turned their hearts elsewhere. And instead of bitterness, I felt gratitude, not for their cruelty, but for what it had forced me to become. I had lived long enough to see myself not as the wounded one, but as the witness who survived the storm and stayed kind anyway. That, I realized, was its own form of triumph. The next morning, I took a walk before dawn. The city was hushed, wet with last night's rain, the streets glistening like glass. At the park near the river, I stopped by a bench and sat. The air was cold against my face, clean and merciful. I reached into my purse and pulled out the photograph Kieran had left behind. Me holding him, both of us caught mid-laughter. I tore it in half, then into quarters, not from anger, but release. The pieces scattered into the river like pale birds, carried away by a current that didn't need my permission. I whispered, "Go on then, take what's left." The wind lifted the sound and let it dissolve. I stood, brushed off my coat, and felt lighter than I had in decades. When I returned home, Joyce was making breakfast, humming off key. She looked up. "You're up early." "Had to let something go," I said. "Good," she replied. "Make room for whatever comes next." I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and smiled. The house smelled of butter and old wood, and for once I didn't feel like an intruder in my own story. The newspaper lay open to the local section again. But this time I didn't look for my name. I didn't need proof of existence from anyone's ink. My life was proof enough. Later that afternoon, the mail arrived, mostly bills and flyers, but at the bottom was a small envelope with handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single page, no signature, just a sentence. I told them the truth. Love, always. I didn't need to guess who had sent it. I folded it carefully, slid it into the back of my notebook, and closed it. I didn't cry, not even when I realized that this was what forgiveness actually felt like. Not fireworks, not reunion, but the quiet acceptance that you have finally stopped needing anything from the people who once defined you. That night, as I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, I whispered to the dark, "It's over now." Not the years, not the memories, but the weight of them. The next morning, the sun found me sleeping deeply, dreamlessly, as though even my heart had decided it was safe to rest. The days that followed were slow in a way that felt deliberate, as if time itself had loosened its grip and decided to let me breathe. Morning came without urgency, soft and forgiving. The light through my window carried no sharpness anymore, only warmth, the kind that asks for nothing but your quiet attention. I rose early, as I always did, but instead of rushing to prepare for work, I stood by the window for a long while, watching the street wake up. There was comfort in its ordinariness, the sound of delivery trucks, a woman walking her dog, the hiss of a kettle from a neighbor's kitchen. Life had returned to its small, precise rhythms, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to happen. I had already lived through the event, the reckoning, the silence that followed. What remained now was life stripped of expectation, life as it truly is when no one is watching. Joyce said I'd become pleasant to live with, which was her way of saying that the restlessness had gone out of me. She never asked about Kieran again, and I never volunteered anything. It wasn't avoidance, it was understanding. Some conversations, when repeated, only dilute what they once meant. We fell into our routines, she with her crossword puzzles and her cigarettes, me with my morning walks and quiet shifts at the cafe. There was a peace between us built on mutual respect, the kind of companionship that doesn't need affection to feel whole. Sometimes in the evenings, we'd sit on the porch with cups of tea, not talking at all. I came to believe that silence, when shared with someone who has also survived her own private wars, can be the purest form of friendship. One afternoon, I took the old photograph of Kieran and me, the one I had torn up by the river, and printed another copy from the file Joyce had helped me find online. I didn't frame it this time. I simply tucked it inside a book of poems I'd started reading at night. I wanted it there, not as a monument to pain or nostalgia, but as proof that memory could exist without bitterness. I could look at that image and feel neither longing nor regret, only a quiet gratitude that once, for a time, there had been joy. I had spent too many years trying to preserve things that were never meant to last. Now I understood that not all love is supposed to endure. Some of it is meant to teach you what you can live without. As spring edged closer, the cafe began to fill with new faces, college students, tourists, couples discovering each other in the fragile light of early mornings. I noticed their laughter, their easy gestures, the way they occupied space without apology. Once, I might have resented their confidence. Now I found it beautiful. I learned to smile genuinely at strangers again. Sometimes people lingered to talk, sharing fragments of their lives, without realizing they were confiding in someone who had once stood on the edge of invisibility. I never offered advice. I only listened. Listening, I discovered, was its own form of creation, a way to participate in life without needing to control it. Every so often a letter would arrive, always unsigned, though I knew Kieran's handwriting by now. They were short, careful notes. We moved to a new place near the coast. Leah's expecting in June. I think of you when it rains. He never asked for anything, never promised anything either, and that restraint was his apology, one I was finally ready to accept. I never replied. I didn't need to. There are some relationships that grow stronger in absence, rebuilt not through contact, but through the slow mutual acknowledgement that love can survive without being spoken aloud. The silence between us had changed its shape. It no longer accused. It simply existed, like the pause between heartbeats. When summer arrived, I took a few days off from work and traveled to the coast alone. The sea had always been the one place where I felt both small and infinite at once. The air was sharp with salt and memory, and the horizon seemed endless. I rented a small room near the pier and spent hours walking the shoreline, letting the waves erase my footprints as quickly as I made them. There was something profoundly healing in that act, the steady undoing of every trace I left behind. One morning, I found a piece of driftwood shaped like a heart and carried it back with me. It sits on my dresser now, its edges smooth and pale. To anyone else, it would be nothing, but to me, it's a reminder that even what's been broken can be shaped into something gentle by the sea. On my last evening there, I wrote a note on hotel stationery, though I had no one particular in mind to send it to. It said, "I am not who I was when you left me. I am better. I am smaller in some ways, lighter in others, but I am here. I am still here." I folded it, placed it between the pages of the same book where Kieran's photograph rested, and left it on the windowsill when I checked out. Perhaps someone will find it someday. Perhaps not. It doesn't matter. Some words are meant only to be released, not received. Back home, life resumed its gentle pattern. Joyce grew slower that year, her sharp wit dulled by the creeping fog of age. One night, she forgot to turn off the stove and laughed when I scolded her. "You sound like my mother," she said. I smiled. "Then you're in good hands." I took care of her the way I once took care of everyone else, but this time there was no resentment in the giving. It was the natural rhythm of affection, quiet, unspectacular, real. When she passed away the following winter, she did so in her sleep, Franklin curled beside her. The morning I found her, I sat by her bed for a long while, holding her hand, whispering, "Thank you." It was gratitude, not grief. She had given me the home I hadn't known I was still capable of building. After the funeral, I decided to stay in the house. It didn't feel empty. It felt entrusted. The cat stayed too, though he pretended indifference. I kept working at the cafe, though fewer hours now, and in the evenings I began to write. Not for anyone, not for legacy, just for the sake of putting memory into order. The stories that came out weren't dramatic or bitter. They were small accounts of moments that had passed unnoticed. The smell of baking bread, the sound of distant trains, the way light touches a face when forgiveness finally settles in. I called them letters to no one, and they became the way I kept company with myself. Sometimes, when I look out the window in the early hours, I think about other women like me, the ones who were forgotten, dismissed, or gently erased, their lives shrinking around the weight of other people's needs. I hope they find what I found, though I wouldn't wish the road I took on anyone. If I could speak to them, I would tell them this: don't wait to be chosen. Don't wait to be remembered. You can walk out of the story that hurt you and write yourself into another. It's quieter there, yes, but the quiet is yours. And in that quiet, you will hear your own voice again, soft at first, then strong, saying, "I am here, I am still here, and that is enough."